Hi, and welcome to this episode of Weight Loss Winformation. This episode is actually a request from a couple of different people, and it's a follow up episode to a prior podcast episode. I think it was called Big T and Little T Trauma. So, a couple of people said, I really liked this. It really brought some things home to me. If you haven't listened to this episode, I would definitely encourage you to go and do that because this information can be really transformational in your weight loss journey, because I think a lot of people don't understand that some of the emotional struggles we face as we go through the weight loss journey could be related to prior traumas that we experienced earlier in life, because if those things aren't addressed, they can show up in our adult lives, and that can be real confusing. So go back and listen to that episode. I think we did a good job in there of explaining this process. A lot of people were really, really grateful for that missing piece of information. In other words, a lot of times we behave in certain ways and we might not understand why. We might be easily triggered by something. We might overreact to things and not understand what was that overreaction all about. And sometimes it's related to prior traumas. In fact, we're brand new into the new year, and over Christmas, I experienced some kind of intense internal emotional reaction. And it's not the first time that I've had this over Christmas. And I was very much more aware of this emotion or this feeling within myself. And I told my husband, I don't understand necessarily what's going on with me, but I do know that I'm feeling some intense. It felt like rage. Honestly, it was this deep-seated anger, and then there was this huge layer of sadness that went with that. And again, it's not the first time I felt that at Christmas time, but being aware of it helped me prevent overreacting or taking it out on other people. And that's what I mean by sometimes these trauma responses can show up in our present day lives. Because if I was just having these intense emotions, not aware that they were out of context to what was actually going on this year, it was not that. It was a relaxed, peaceful holiday, and I just had this intense internal stuff going on. And so I talked to my husband about it, and I said, I don't want to take it out on anybody. I just want you to be aware that it's there, and I'm aware of it, and I'm trying not to let it eke out all over the place. I haven't fully processed that yet, but I have an awareness because it's not the first time it's happened. So, tonight in this episode, we're going to be talking about some ways to handle when we have a response in our present day life that may be linked to a trauma in the past. And that was what the request for this podcast was. It was like, thank you for explaining this big T, little t trauma, how it can show up in our lives. But what do I do about it when it does? So what we're going to do in this episode is I'm going to do a short review of what I'm talking about, this big T trauma, this little t trauma, where it comes from, and then talk a little bit more about how it can show up in our everyday lives. And finally, talk about ways to deal with these unexpected sometimes, or these what might look like overreactions to outside people, and maybe feel like an overreaction to ourselves, and we may or may not be able to place the origin of the intense feeling. But we're going to talk about all of that and ways to handle those things throughout this episode. So when we talk about trauma, what I want you to understand is that events themselves aren't necessarily traumatic. The event, how it's perceived and how it affects a human being, is where the trauma response comes in. Some people have more innate resiliency. Some people, traumas bother more than others. Some people are able to process it and bounce back more quickly. They have better resilience. So don't judge yourself about this, but educate yourself about this. This is really, really important. Science has come a long way in understanding trauma and understanding that we don't have to go through a big T trauma to have reactions that may come up later in our lives from trauma. So, when we talk about big T traumas, we're talking about those kind of life altering events that cause profound psychological distress and long lasting effects. When we think PTSD and we think of combat veterans, that's big T trauma. But there are other examples of big T trauma like natural disasters or a physical assault or sexual abuse, uh, some sort of traumatic medical trauma or a terrorist attack. So, really, really, what we think of as, oh my gosh, I must never have had trauma because I didn't go through any of those things. Thank goodness if you haven't. But those are what we would consider big T traumas. And big T or little t, which I'll explain in just a minute, we either work through those things and we talk about them and we express them and get them out, or we internalize them. And it's when we internalize those things that they end up causing more problems later on in life. And a lot of people do internalize those because when you're young, maybe you don't have the resources. Maybe you don't know who to go to talk to about it. Or maybe you think I shouldn't talk about this because I'll get in trouble. Or maybe the people around you are also suffering because of what went on and there's nobody really there to provide comfort for you as a child. And so some of those things become internalized and they can come out in all kinds of ways in our lives later on. Physical health is one of the big ways that researchers are finding out that unexpressed and unresolved trauma are showing up in our lives, primarily through things like, what do you call that? The diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, the ones where there's a lot of internal inflammation, so the inflammatory diseases, but also things like cancers and a whole range of physical issues that are not necessarily inherited, but are the result of how the stress and the trauma increase cortisol, our bodies running on high all the time, high alert, are affecting our internal systems. So that's one of the ways. But the other ways are more, we don't really recognize them as responses to trauma. But if I'm snapping at people, like verbally, or have short temper, or easily anxious, or there's a lot of ways. We'll talk about those in just a minute. So we talked about the big T traumas. This is just a review. Little T traumas are things like maybe you witnessed an accident that was a big accident and you were the witness and that's traumatizing to you. Or maybe a job loss is traumatizing. Being bullied. And I know a lot of the people who struggle with weight issues, especially if you had weight struggles as a young person, you probably endured some bullying or some harassment, any kind of chronic stress. So if you grew up in a household where there was a constant level of tension, I was talking to one of my patients the other day, and she was talking about how in her family, her parents were very good parents in terms of taking good care of her, being present at all of her events, tucking her in, doing all good parenting things. But there was also another generation, a grandmother living in the house, and her mother and grandmother had this constant tension, constant tension. And it was like I said, if you could visualize an electric current in the household at all times, that was like a danger. If I get too close to this current, I'll get electrocuted. And so that constant level of stress in a household can be perceived as a child as being really traumatic, because it's like, oh, you're in a constant state of how can I make this stop, or why won't this go away? And that causes a lot of chaos within a person's body. That's a little T trauma. Neglect or abuse. Moving to a new place can be traumatic. Being sued, being diagnosed with an illness. All kinds of things can fall into the category of traumas. Mostly trauma comes from neglect or abuse. So, when people say, I've never had any kind of trauma, well, if you grew up in a household where, for either financial reasons or lack of interest reasons on the part of the parent, you were never taken to the dentist or the doctor. That's neglectful, and that falls into the category of trauma. Neglect falls into trauma, so it could be medical neglect, it could be educational neglect, or it could be emotional neglect. If you were never, if nobody ever asked you what's going on, or if you went through something at school, if you were being bullied, or let's go with the big ones. Maybe there was some kind of inappropriate fondling or sexual abuse, and you told and nothing was done. Those things are traumatic to a child. So neglect and any kind of abuse, physical, mental, emotional, sexual, a lot of times what we see as a consequence of neglect or abuse or traumas in childhood is doing the same thing to yourself as an adult. So if you think about your present day life, here are some ways that previous neglect or previous trauma can show up in your life today, partly because it's learned. So maybe you don't go to the dentist or the doctor because you were neglected as a child and now you're neglecting your own health. Maybe you neglect your own educational needs. Maybe you have attention deficit disorder and you had it as a kid and your parents said, no kid of mine's going to get treatment for that. Well, maybe now you're like, well, they didn't get me treatment for it, and so maybe I should just suck it up and deal with it. Or maybe you had a learning disability and no one ever saw to it that you got any kind of accommodations, and so now you neglect yourself in the same way. So repeating the same kind of neglect or abuse doesn't mean you're going around, hitting yourself. It could, I suppose, but do you allow other people to verbally abuse you? In other words, prior trauma can show up by you not setting boundaries for yourself and saying, I'm not going to allow you to talk to me that way. I'm not going to stay around and listen to you treat me like that. Or I'm not going to allow you to touch me, whether it's hitting or sexually inappropriate ways. So allowing any kind of abuse or being taken advantage of, that's some of the ways that the earlier traumas can show up in your life. But there are a lot of long-term consequences, and research is very clear about this. People will tell me in therapy that happened a long time ago, and it doesn't bother me. I barely ever think about it. But the truth is, if you haven't really worked through that by talking about it, by talking about what it felt like then, and by talking about how you have fears today, there's a lot of damage. And some of that damage is a lack of self-worth, a lack of self-esteem. If you weren't stood up for in the past, you probably don't stand up for yourself. If nobody protected you from a bully, you probably feel like maybe they were right. Maybe I'm not okay. So a lot of that is a result of big T or little t trauma. And as we talked about in the prior episode, not having compassion for yourself, not thinking you're worth asking for help. It's okay for other people to ask for help, but it's not okay for me to ask for help. It's okay for other people to have empathy in their situation, but not for me. I should be able to handle this. So there's a lot of things physiologically that are affected by big T or little t trauma, but there are also a lot of psychological and emotional reactions. So exposure to trauma, it leaves you very vigilant or hypervigilant physiologically. So if you were a child and when dad came in the door at night and you didn't know what kind of a mood he would be in, maybe the slamming of a door triggers you and you get anxious and you get very nervous. You don't understand necessarily why. And people are like, what's going on with you? And you're like, I don't know, that just startled me. A lot of times, the results of prior trauma will show up in an exaggerated physiological response. So tremendous anxiety or being very, very hyper vigilant. So the fight and flight and freeze and fawn responses you've heard probably, we talked about that in the other episode. It's like you immediately want to take off or you freeze. You just become almost paralyzed in a situation. When something inside of you is triggered that reminds you, whether it's a scent or a sound or a person or a place, or it just triggers that memory in you. A lot of times I tell people that the insides of our brains, it's like we have these file cabinets, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of file cabinets. And in these file cabinets are memories of everything that's ever taken place in our lives. We can't remember all of those things, but those memories are in there. And that has been shown to be true by brain surgeons who will tap a part of a person's brain and they will completely remember in vivid detail things from the past. So we subconsciously have these file cabinets opening and closing in our minds all the time. And if something happens, say you're at the office and the boss, gets angry and comes storming in your office and, is accusing you of not having something done. And, you have this, anybody would react to that, but maybe, people would react on a scale of 3 to 4 out of 10, but yours is like a 9. Maybe that's because you experienced some other kind of being blamed or for maybe one of your siblings' actions and you got harshly punished. And so this is triggering that file cabinet that opened and you have that memory. So when something inside of us is triggered that reminds us of something from the past, we may have a physiological response where we want to, put up your dukes and fight. We have that fight response, or we have the flight, I'm going to get the heck out of here, or we have the freeze, or the other one is fawn, which means I'm going to make sure I am the biggest people pleaser on the planet, because if I can please all the people all the time, nobody's ever going to be mad at me. So those are some of the reactions that we have. So when a trauma is triggered, oftentimes we are not aware of it, then we will have this physiological response. We might go, like I did at Christmas, like I have this intense emotion and I don't know what it's about. I can go back and I have some clues as to what that's about. So I'm not completely clueless, but I could do some more exploration of that. We'll talk about the reason for doing that later on. We talked about the ACEs study, the adverse childhood experiences study, and that shows that trauma as a young person leaves an adult very, very vulnerable, like I said, to these chronic diseases and other physical illnesses. Not only that, but to a lot of mental health challenges. Substance-related disorders are very common in people who suffered traumatic childhood events, as is food addiction or the abuse of food or using food as an emotional way to deal with things. So there's a lot of people who have struggled with emotional eating or food addiction or weight struggles. The disease of obesity is oftentimes connected to these childhood traumas. So that's how some of it shows up in adult life, but we don't necessarily think, oh, my weight is connected to a traumatic childhood event or trauma in my life. There's a great study done by Kaiser Permanente years ago who talked about physicians understanding that there's a huge connection between childhood trauma and the use of food. The article is called Obesity, Problem, Solution, or Both. And what they pointed out is that in their study, they learned that the use of food is very comforting to people. And so food can be a solution to repressed childhood trauma. And a lot of times we repeat in our adult lives what we went through as children. So if you were in an abusive childhood, maybe you're in an abusive relationship as an adult. Well, food can be that same kind of comfort. And, if that's your go-to, then that can lead to or exacerbate whatever other setups you have for having the disease of obesity. So that's one of the kinds of things. Now, another thing, like I said, is hypervigilance or hyperarousal or anxiety, panic disorder, often linked to prior unexpressed or unresolved traumas. And so these things, how they come out and play in day to day, we misinterpret a lot of times what people say to us because it's based on thoughts that we created related to these childhood events. So let's say you were picked on at school because of your weight or whatever reason. And this happened in second grade and third grade and fifth grade, lots of grades. And your takeaway from that is, as a young child, is if this keeps happening to me in all these different grades and environments and different people, something must be wrong with me. I'm the common denominator here. And so as an adult, you have this assumption built in that people are picking on you when maybe or maybe they aren't. It's just a thought that you planted in your brain because of what was happening around you. You were being traumatized. And now that trauma, it wants to protect you. And so you're always on guard, fearing you're going to be being picked on. People who are very, very defensive. And I've shared this example many times in the past related to my husband, and he's okay with me doing that. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Sneezes happen. But my mother-in-law had 6 children, and all of them would attest to the fact that my husband was her scapegoat. She took out her anger on him for whatever reason, but he was her target. And so this showed up in our adult life. He is so quick to defensiveness. And I'm like, my God, that was one of the big things we dealt with in therapy as a couple is he's so quick to defensiveness. He's, I'll say, hey, do the refrigerator was left over. I didn't do it. Whoa. I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Why the scale of 10 reaction to a 2 comment? Well, we discovered, and he uncovered in therapy, that he was so defensive as a child because his mother blamed him and picked on him for anything, that he's highly, highly sensitive. So that is a trauma response in his adult life. One of mine would be, I've shared this so many times, is my quick temper. It's like, I'm going to shut you down with my anger before it's a protective thing, because I don't like to have something directed my way when I had nothing to do with it. But that's a childhood response. And it comes out in my adult life. So a lot of these things will come out in our day-to-day lives. Excessive guilt. Feeling excessively guilty may come from being a child who thinks I should be able to solve the problems in the family, or make my mom happy, or make my dad calm down, or not drink so much, or whatever. A lot of our reactions come from shame. If you were made fun of because of your weight, or if you were picked on because of your weight, or if you were called names because of your weight, or any other thing, it's led to a feeling of not being good enough. And so the slightest hint of not being accepted brings up that shame of I'm not good enough. And then we behave in all kinds of ways out of our shame. Some people become very braggadocious, like I'm going to cover up my feelings of insecurity by acting like I know it all, or acting like I have it all together. Other forms of shame are taking on the blame for everything, or hiding away from everything because you just don't feel like you fit in, or not following through with your goals or your pursuits. There are all kinds of things. Our communication is a great example of how childhood trauma affects us. If we're unable to set boundaries, or ask for what we want, or ask for help, or share our needs with people, oftentimes that is a result of not having been acknowledged. So it would fall in the neglect category. So nobody paid attention to you as a kid or tended to your emotional needs. So now you feel like you're not important enough, and so you don't even bring those things up anymore. Or maybe you lived in that chronic tense household, and so you're a people pleaser. You're always trying to make people happy, so nobody has a chance to get all worked up. Or maybe you're a control freak because you think, oh, if I can control everything here, then I can I can manage everybody, but you can't. But a lot of these things, and we are so unaware of it, that they may be connected directly to some kind of traumas. So I'm going to give you some other more specific examples here of things that come up in everyday life that may or may not be connected to trauma. But the way you can kind of tell sometimes is by paying attention to overreactions. It's fairly easiest for us to recognize an overreaction in another person. We might be like, "Wow, what was the big deal that you exploded like that, or that you got that defensive, or that you were that embarrassed, or that, an overreaction in another person is often an indication that something from some kind of trauma or shame has been triggered in them, and they are reacting to that as an adult. It's harder for us to see our own overreactions, but it doesn't mean that we don't have them. So one of the things you can do is ask people in your life to point out if that was some sort of overreaction in our lives. You may or may not have heard of the term emotional dysregulation. Well, that's a fancy psychological word, meaning how well do you manage your emotions in situations. So if you're at home or at work or on the bus or traveling or whatever it is, and something makes you angry or something delays you, or and we're not talking about because you're overly tired or haven't had anything to eat and you're hangry. We're talking about on the regular. All right, if you aren't able to behave in a respectable, polite manner most of the time, might have a one-off and you go kind of a little, get a little unkind with the customer service person. But if that's your go-to, if you're always coming unglued, or if you're the one at the doctor's office demanding and being entitled that you should be able to see if you're overreacting, everybody else is late for or being held up for their appointment, but you're up there making the scene and pounding your fist on the counter. It's kind of an overreaction. So if you're not able to control or regulate your emotional responses in provocative situations, to provocative stimuli, I'll share this example, and I think I might have used it in the last one when I talked about trauma. But my best friend and myself and our husbands were on a vacation together, and we sat through a timeshare presentation, and my friend's husband got into a little debate with the person trying to sell the timeshare, and it turned into a big, not debate, but like almost a shouting match in public. And my friend's husband was getting louder and louder and louder. And so he was being provoked by this guy, and he was getting louder and louder, which is not an appropriate regulation of his emotion. My friend, whose father was a yeller and screamer, starts crying because her trigger was her husband's loud voice, which reminded her of the trauma of hearing her father screaming a lot. So we have this big situation. We all processed it later. She understood what her overreaction was, or her bursting into tears because she was frightened by the sound of her husband's voice, which reminded her of her father. Her husband, who got really angry with the timeshare guy, was provoked because he felt like the guy was telling him he was stupid. And his father had very often referred to him as being stupid. So that was his emotional dysregulation. So when that was a file cabinet being opened in his brain. He heard his father's voice coming from this guy who was not telling him he was stupid, but that was her husband's assumption, or the way he thought the guy was coming at him, because it was a sore spot for him, pushed a button, triggered something within him. So not only was the response a trigger, a response trauma from his childhood, but in the present moment, but so was his thought process. In other words, the guy wasn't telling him he was stupid. This was my friend's husband's thought, because that's the message he had received and internalized as a child. Just like my husband's very quick defensive response is partly the defensiveness, but it's also the thought that you're picking on me, you're blaming me for something I didn't do, because that's what his mother did. So we internalize these thoughts, and whenever we perceive these things coming at us from a friend or a coworker or a partner or a child or a parent or whoever, and we overreact to it, it's because we've internalized some true or not true message that we're reacting to. So when we are unable to control or regulate our emotional responses to these things that open a file drawer in our brain, it's called emotional dysregulation, and that is a sign that we are responding to a past trauma. So when we act out our childhood issues, any kind of unresolved, and behave in really super reactive, unhealthy, unproductive, insecure ways, it's an indication that maybe we're reacting to some kind of traumatic experience and a file drawer opening or closing in our brain. Now, this can happen in your interpersonal relationships, like when we overreact to any kind of comment by our partner or whatever. My husband used to say to me, "Why do you have to say it like that?" Because my response was an automatic overreaction. I was loud, I was sarcastic, I was too much anger, too much energy. It was like, what is that about for you? Well, it was about a lot of childhood trauma growing up in a very loud, chaotic home. And so I'm repeating that in my adult life. So maybe we're completely unaware of what we're doing, because I was like, what do you mean, react like what? Because I couldn't hear myself the way he could, or other people most likely could. So if we're super responsive to even a perceived criticism or a perceived slight, it's an indication likely that we're reacting to some kind of trauma. It's these overreactions. So again, there's a lot of research showing that emotional eating or food addiction can be a response to childhood trauma, big T or little t trauma. And so we may not be aware of that. We just think we like sweets. There could be a sugar addiction, or it could be that I'm looking for something that soothes me and gives me that dopamine hit. Even though it's not an addiction, it's anytime I hear a raised voice, I want something soothing. So it could be an emotional response to a file cabinet opening saying, danger, danger, danger. So a lot of food issues are, but also if you think about the people in your home particularly, because we tend to misbehave at home more than we do in public. So if you're a pouter in your adult relationship. Pouting is a childish behavior, but how many of us pout to get our way, or to be passive aggressive and let our partner know we're mad without saying a thing? Or, I'm just going to sit here and give you the silent treatment until you give me what I want. So that's often a sign. I mean, that's an inappropriate adult response. It could be that we just don't have the skills, we're ill-equipped, but it also could be that this passive aggressive is something we learned and we are now repeating. any kind of unhealthy defense mechanism, like if we're rationalizing our behavior, think about how often you rationalize your use of unhealthy foods or your overconsumption of unhealthy foods. It's a holiday or it's a Tuesday or it was in the break room or I deserve it or I've had a hard day. So over rationalizing is kind of an example of I'm making excuses for my unhealthy behavior rather than coping with whatever stress or kind of trauma might be going on. When we judge somebody, when we blame, when we take our anger out on others. Some of this is learned behavior. Like I said, maybe that's just what you witnessed and so you repeat it. But some of it is related at times to unresolved trauma. So, my friend said to me one time, I think I've shared this with you before too. She said, and this was back in the day, back in the day. And she would say to me when she would hear me talk to Steve impolitely, she'd be like, "What gives you the right to treat him that way?" I was like, wow, nothing, except that's how everybody in my family treated everybody, disrespectfully. And that constant disrespect and high level of tension in my childhood was a trauma. It was a trauma scene. It was like that lightning bolt in the air all the time. But that didn't give me a right to repeat it. Um, when we pick a fight, it might be a response to trauma. When we abuse ourselves, whether it's how we eat or excessive alcohol consumption or um, inappropriate name calling of ourselves in the form of negative self talk, a lot of these things are reactions to trauma. So, what do we do about that? I've given you lots of examples of how these things show up in our lives. So, the question was, what do I do when this shows up in my life? How do I combat that? Well, I came across a really good article by a Dr. Michelle Maidenberg called The Secret to Healing Trauma. So, I'm going to share with you some of the things that she suggests and explain them, especially in relation to our use of food or our misuse of food and other trauma reactions. And then I'll give you some in the moment kind of examples of things you can do when you recognize that maybe you're overreacting or maybe your internal response to something going on feels like a bigger deal than anybody else in the situation might um, think it is. All right, so Dr. Maidenberg says recognize that your trauma, the thing that happened to you, or this response in the present, it's part of you, but it's not all of you. So it doesn't define who you are or speak to who you are. And as you become aware of what you're doing, you have a choice as to go with the initial response or say, wait a minute, I don't need to do that in this situation because my dad isn't here. He isn't yelling at me. Or Steve might say, you're not my mother. You're not blaming me. I don't need to respond in that same way. But recognize, like I had to recognize that my overly intense tone of voice was not okay in everyday use. And so I've had to learn, it's still pretty intense. I have a very intense voice. So I've had to really learn, especially when I'm upset or angry, to really modulate my voice because my voice can trigger other people too. They might get scared or they might want to, just shut down. But if I can say I'm upset about this using a fairly normal tone of voice and not use my reactive, overly reactive tone of voice. And we can learn this, but we have to recognize that, okay, this is a part of who I am, but I don't have to say I'm a terrible person because of it. So recognize that you may have this area where you're an overreactor. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're a loser and there's nothing you can do about this. So understand that you don't have to bully yourself because maybe you respond poorly to a specific tone of voice, or a certain scent, or the sound of something that triggers you, and you overreact. So recognize it's part of you, but it doesn't have to determine your behavior. Once you're aware of it, just like at Christmas, I was like, this is an inappropriate response. Everything's going great. We're having a really nice Christmas. There's nothing really going on, and I'm having these super intense emotions. So I was aware of that. I'm like, okay, it doesn't mean I have to be nasty to anybody. It doesn't mean I have to be short-tempered. It doesn't mean I have to, you know, impinge on anybody else's good time. All right, the next thing she says to do is be curious and study yourself. We tend to judge ourselves and get down on ourselves. So instead of going, God, what is the matter with me? I'm such a loser. I'm so mean. I'm such a bee. Instead of doing that, go, what was that all about? Gosh, the situation didn't call for that. A lot of times we find ourselves super reactive to our kids, and it might be because we've had a bad day and we're tired and all of those things. So it could be that, or it could be some kind of trigger and you want to have control of the situation, and so you get demanding or whatever it is. Then go to your kids and say, you know what? I had no right to talk to you the way I did earlier today. I am really sorry. That was not about you. Yes, I did not like when you threw your backpack on the floor, but I am going to work on how I talk to you about those things. So just owning it and be curious, like, why would I react so strongly to a kid being a kid? Throwing their backpack on the floor instead of putting it on the hook is probably a normal kid thing to do. Why did I act like they had just robbed the bank? So when those symptoms arise, when we find ourselves overreacting in some way, then just question yourself. It's like, what's going on with me? What does that remind me of? Have I ever felt this way in the past? And maybe you can connect it to something and maybe you can't. But you can always go and make amends for any inappropriate kind of behavior. And that helps clear the air with people. Now, one of the things that is harder to recognize, but I encourage you to really look at this, is a lot of times we are emotionally triggered in such a way that the thought that came with whatever happened earlier comes into play, and we don't act it out, but we perseverate on that thought. So, for example, let's say that you were the last person picked for all the recess classes, team things for all 8 of your elementary school years. And the implied message is, nobody wants me on their team. That was me, right? I was never one of the first kids picked for any kind of athletic event. And so I'm like, oh my God, nobody wants me on their team. Now, it would be easy if you're in a team building event as an adult at work and, they're pairing you off and you're like, nobody's going to want me on their team. Well, that's a response from childhood. And we sabotage ourselves in those ways. Just like when we think, oh, everybody in the restaurant is looking at me, or I don't want to go to that because I know everybody's going to be thinking I'm the biggest person in the room, or chances are that's not really what's going on, but that is something you have settled upon in your head. And so if you have people you're really close to, or a therapist, it's really good to talk about those things. Sometimes when I'm in situations, I think everybody's looking at me, or I easily feel abandoned. That comes up a lot at the retreats. Like, somebody will eventually be courageous enough to say, I didn't feel like I was being heard when we were having that group discussion. Well, it probably has nothing to do with what was really going on, but your perception is nobody's listening to you and nobody wants to hear me and I'm feeling rejected and abandoned. That is probably coming from somewhere back in the day, because as a healthy adult, you go, hey guys, I'm trying to say something here and I'd appreciate if you would listen. But we don't do that because we act out of the trauma and the unresolved emotional issues. Sometimes, we project anger, or sometimes we accuse our partners of, you're not interested in me, or you don't pay any attention to me, because that's something from our past, and we're projecting that onto them. And they're like, what are you talking about? I don't understand. All right. So be curious. Where's this coming from, and what can I do about it? And another thing she says is identify the negative core beliefs that were formed, which was kind of what I'm talking about already. So, what perceptions did you come up with about yourself or others or the world based on the experiences you had? Because these can really throw a wrench into your healthy adult life. So, if you've decided that, you know, people are always, judging you or looking at you, then you're going into situations with a chip on your shoulder or an expectation of how you're going to be treated. And then you have a self-fulfilling prophecy. Nobody talked to me at work. Nobody invites me out to lunch. But maybe you're, not looking at anybody or talking to anybody at work because you've already got these preconceived core beliefs. So, are these beliefs that you have formed legitimate in your adult life? Now, this is something that often takes some therapy to work out, because we go around thinking, we make a lot of assumptions. They don't like me, or they're just jealous, or they're thinking this about me, or they're thinking. That is a totally unfair thing to do to anybody else, because you wouldn't want somebody to do it to you. So where did that come from? What was your experience that left you thinking, you know, all men are pigs, right? My mom, she was big on all men are pigs. So you grew up with this idea that all men are pigs. And then my poor husband, who is a very great man, I wouldn't believe him. I'd be like, no, you're just saying that because that's what you want me to think. You know it's not true. You know you're just like all the other men. Well, that was so unfair to him, and it was an absolute belief I formed based on A, what my mother said, and B, how my father behaved. So, not fair. We're unfair in that way based on prior issues and an overreaction in our adult lives. So, what kind of fears or insecurities are you challenged with? I don't belong. I'm not good enough. Nobody wants me around. They're just laughing at me. Nobody really thinks I'm funny. They're just being polite. Whatever it happens to be, what are these insecurities and where do they come from? Because maybe they no longer serve you. They probably never served you well, but maybe they're based on absolute things that were not true, but you interpreted those things as a child. For example, when I always thought that I wasn't very intelligent, and I didn't think my dad thought I was very intelligent. And when I was applying for my PhD program, I called him on the phone and I was like, Dad, I need to know if you think I'm smart enough to do this. And he was like, what are you even talking about? But the way my father talked about women, particularly in general, I just thought he thought all women were stupid. And that was a very difficult thing for me to get over. And even when I go to conferences to this day, I have to be very careful, because that thought that I created, that, I'm not very smart. Sometimes when I'm in a conference, I'll hear these people and I go right to that shame of I'm not very smart. And then I have to talk to myself. Talking to yourself is a great tool to use. It's like, this doesn't belong here. I am intelligent. I do belong here. So you talk yourself out of, but you recognize what the insecurity was. Another thing she says to do is look at how your reactions are affecting your relationships. Again, do you preemptively formulate judgments or assumptions about yourself or other people? Are you holding back from being open and vulnerable? And if so, how? So again, be curious. You've got to learn about yourself. You've got to look at yourself. You've got to get feedback from other people to see where, you know, your reactions are outside the norm. And how compassionate are you with other people and yourself? She says, look at your level of compassion. Are you able to be compassionate toward yourself? If you're not, like I said earlier, it is a sign that maybe you're reacting to these beliefs you formed or some other kind of trauma. Are you willing to accept love and approval and acceptance and generosity from other people? Or do you shy away from that and sabotage them from letting them treat you kindly because you don't believe you deserve it? Be curious. Look for where your behavior is causing you problems. And then she says, are you putting adequate time and effort toward healing? Because the deal is, when we have trauma as a child and we have very well established habits of being defensive or blaming others or assuming that we know what other people are thinking or being judgmental, we're not going to let that go in a day, because a lot of this stuff was very protective and it's not working as an adult. And so we have to have time and we need to put forth effort. Again, a lot of this takes professional help. Now, some things you can do immediately. If you become highly anxious, like my friend's husband in that situation, he was becoming angrier and angrier and getting more and more agitated. If he would have paid attention to his body signals, I'm sure he was breathing more rapidly. He was probably clenching his jaw or his fists or whatever. If you find yourself getting more and more agitated, one of the best things you can do, and you've heard this 1,000 times, but these are in the moment techniques that will help calm you down so you can think more logically and get a hold of yourself. Because when we are able to recognize that we're overreacting or being overly stimulated or overly anxious or overly angry or overly defensive, breathing. Inhale to a count of 3, 4, 5, but exhale twice that amount and do it for a couple of minutes. It's the number one way to calm anxiety, to bring yourself to a more stable position physiologically and in your mind. And when your mind is more settled, you can make better decisions. Okay, all right, I'm calm now. I reacted to that person for whatever reason. Maybe you're able to say, they reminded me of my dad, or maybe you can't place it all. You just know that I need to settle down in this moment. I'll figure out the cause of it later. But breathing is the number one way to do that. And then have a little talk with yourself. Be the voice of logic that is responding to these intense emotions. And say, if I yell at this person, how am I going to feel? How are they going to feel? If I calm myself down and have a discussion about it, what's the outcome more likely to be? Use your 5 senses. I know that with my grandkids in their therapy, a lot of times the therapist would tell them when they get very anxious, what is something you can hear? What is something you can smell? What is something you can see? What is something you can feel, like cold air or warm air? Use those senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, to anchor yourself in the present, because a lot of times when we are triggered and we find ourselves overreacting, our mind has gone somewhere else. It's gone to wherever that file cabinet is, consciously or subconsciously. So we anchor ourselves in the present by using our 5 senses. That also brings us back to the moment and go, wait a minute. In this moment, I want to respond like a healthy adult. How would a healthy adult respond in this moment? Or maybe you already blew it and you yelled at your kid or your spouse or the customer service person. Draw yourself back in and say, listen, I know I overreacted to your comment. That is on me. You didn't deserve that. Can we start over? So it's not like you're going to catch yourself every time ahead of time. Now, I personally love my weighted blanket. It is one of my favorite things when I am beside myself. And actually, I did do this at Christmas. I literally curled up in the bed because I just didn't know what to do with my big emotions. And there was really nobody home. My husband was home, but and my dog. And so my dog and I got on the bed and I just cuddled under that weighted blanket for about 20 minutes just to, just to go, I don't know what's going on with me, but I don't want to ruin the day for myself or anybody else. And I'm just going to lay here until I feel like I can get up and function like more like my normal self, given whatever's going on inside of me. So having things like a weighted blanket, or do something like go empty the dishwasher. It's a task. It's something you're familiar with. You can focus on what you're doing, and you can kind of let go of some other things. Um, Being mindful. Don't judge yourself. Just kind of being curious, like, oh my God, look at me. I am yelling. Why am I yelling at people? You know, I can choose to stop this right now, regardless of where it came from. I can make a choice to stop this. So become an outside observer of your own behavior. And a lot of times, just moving, get yourself out of the situation and, go in the bathroom and stomp your feet or splash cold water on your face is a good way to bring you back more to the present. If you are a highly reactive person, one of the best things you can do is stick to a routine in your life. Make sure that your lifestyle is filled with healthy habits, the gotta do ums, eating on schedule, making sure you eat healthy food, getting your sleep, if you're struggling, stay away from things like alcohol and cigarettes, and unhealthy foods as coping mechanisms. They're not going to help. As you learn your triggers, make a list of them. And then if you go home and you're like, my God, I just kind of came undone in the meeting at work today, kind of look over your list and go, and then maybe make a list of your triggers and go, what was that about for me? Just kind of process it. Do some journaling, do some writing, do something kind instead of beating yourself up. Go sit in a hot bathtub and just process and go, what was I thinking? Maybe call your best friend and say, I did this today and I am clueless as to what was going on with me. And maybe they have some insight into you that you're not able to glean on your own. One of the best things to do is to talk about it, whether you already blew it or whether you know that you're in a highly volatile situation. Like, instead of taking it out on somebody, go out and make a phone call and say, I'm feeling really angry and I feel like my anger is out of line with the situation, but it doesn't matter. This is how I'm feeling. Can I talk to you about it? Journaling is always great to help process things. Getting out of yourself. If you're like, whatever's going on with me, I don't know, but I'm having a hard time shaking it. I'm going to go offer to help somebody else with something, because you're getting out of yourself and it kind of gives you time to get away from overthinking about it and over processing it. We can do that sometimes. And learn to recognize your typical reactions. I get very anxious when a man walks into the room, or I get very nervous if I hear the sound of a door slam, or I get very sad if I hear this kind of music. Identify your patterns and your typical reactions and learn more about yourself. The best things to do in the moment, though, are slow yourself down, bring yourself to the moment. If you've got an ability, the time, whatever, take yourself out of the situation. Always remember you can go back and make amends as is appropriate. And if you use food, if you return to food as a coping skill, or if you maybe drink too much or you cigarette or whatever it is, it's like, okay, forgive yourself. forgive yourself and recognize, I don't have to do that next time. The more you process what's going on with you and can recognize your own patterns, you can prevent the same thing from happening in the future. So, take home messages. Again, review, get some podcasts. Go listen to the podcast episode on Big T and Little T trauma. Read some stuff on trauma. Read some stuff about trauma responses. The more information you have and the more willing you are to seek therapy or talk to a trusted friend about your behaviors, then the more able you will be in the future to go, okay, I no longer have to respond like that. This is a response that belonged in the past, or this thought is not helping me. I'm going to change that thought and learn to be kinder and more compassionate to yourself. So review what kind of traumas you've had, learn to recognize your triggers, and 3, get help in whatever way that means. I have a really good friend, and she and I, we say, okay, when's our next sleepover? She lives in Texas. So I'll either fly out there and we meet in Dallas and we sit and talk for a day. It's just a one-night thing. We talk the next morning, and then if she comes here, then she flies home. If I go there, I fly home. But she is a person I can tell anything to. And I have a couple of those. I have one in Iowa, and it's just a gift because I can be very vulnerable, and I know they're going to give me feedback, but they're going to do it with such great love and care. So learn about yourself. Life is a process of growing. Don't be afraid to say, you know what, I've got these things, these behaviors that are getting in my way. And sometimes those things lead you back to overeating for comfort. And that's not going to help you with your weight goals or your life goals. So these are some great skills that you can use to handle trauma responses from the past that occur in the present. I hope this was helpful. I would love to get some feedback about if this filled in some blanks for some of you that wanted some clarification about what do I do when these things happen. And also continue to let me know what you would like for future podcast episodes. I really love doing the podcast. I always learn things because I always review some stuff before I do the podcast. And it's a great reminder for my own mental and physical health as well. So I thank you for keeping me on top of my own issues. All right. Remember, we're talking about your health, which is your responsibility this day and every day. And please, if you are not part of the greater Weight Loss Winformation program, then please become part of it. We are now sending things out in a formulaic way. You get different pieces of the program, so it's not all splayed at you at once. And that will be hopefully live and running by the time this podcast episode airs. But we also, as part of Weight Loss Winformation, have the Berry Aftercare community, which is an online Facebook page, private, and that's where we can go and help each other to work through these issues because most of us struggle with them. So please join Weight Loss Winformation /Berry Aftercare and become part of this amazing community. It's long-term aftercare for your weight loss living. All right, then. Thanks for being with me again I want to say tonight. Maybe it's not night where you are, but it is here. All right. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.